Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Rangers Review morning briefing. I'm Blair Malloy, and as you'll have probably seen, Derek is on his holidays this week, so it's a bit of musical chairs in the hosting seat. So I'm taking you through today. I'm joined by the wonderful Josh Barry. Josh, how are we getting on?
Good. That's a much nicer intro than Derek ever gives me. He has picked some week for his holidays, Blair, hasn't he? But yeah, I'm fine, mate. Listen, busy times. Busy times. A lot going on at Rangers, as everyone will be aware, and the clock's ticking because the game against Dundee United isn't far away, and there's two really important fixtures after that too. So yeah, lots to get into, and looking forward to discussing it with you.
Absolutely. We've got a mountain of stuff to get into this morning, and I think that is putting it lightly. Before we get into it, a little word for our sponsors, Willow's Fencing, the Glasgow-based fencing company that you can trust. See the ticker along the bottom of this video for 10% off with the code Rangers Review. Thanks a lot to them for sponsoring today's episode. So, Josh, it was Friday, I think I was last on one of these podcasts, and it looked for all the world then that I was talking about Steven Gerrard arriving at Rangers and
Yeah.
everything seemed to be going swimmingly. What a difference a few days can make in the life of any Rangers fan. So give us a little bit of a little bit of the landscape as to where we are now as the search for this head coach goes into its second week.
Yeah, so that's what day is it today? Tuesday. It feels like a lot
Tuesday,
a lot
yeah.
longer. Feels like times move very fast. Yeah, obviously the whole back we're going to come on to talk about Kevin Muscat this morning, but the whole backdrop, Blair, of this managerial hunt and or head coach hunt, I should say, and where Rangers find themselves now, you can't separate it from Steven Gerrard. Chris and I had a longer piece with a bit more detail, hopefully that people can get into on the website yesterday, that tried to explain a little bit more about what we'd kind of discussed when Gerrard was initially coming over to have those talks on Thursday, that they weren't just introductory, and that one of the biggest topic of conversations we were led to understood would be on the table was how would he fit into the structure comparatively to before. And fundamentally, for him, he's in a different place to where he was in 2018. Could both sides compromise? Could both sides make it work? By Saturday night, it emerged that Gerrard would not be returning to Rangers, and that leads them on to who comes next. Danny Röhl had already spoken to Rangers by that point, and I think we've mentioned a few times that he'd impressed. Now, again, I know people won't like that because of the narrative of the last search with Russell Martin. And yesterday it emerged, and we reported on the website that Kevin Muscat, who's a name that, as of maybe Thursday last week, it was our understanding that there hadn't been contact established and that he wasn't really a name in the frame, or if he was a name in the frame, he perhaps hadn't come to the top of that renewed shortlist after what emerged with Steven Gerrard towards the tail end of last week. Our understanding is that is now changed, and there has been contact established. Now, that is not me saying that he's definitively going to be the next Rangers manager. Danny Röhl remains in that race too. There will be names that Rangers have spoke to that us or others do not know about. However, if you'd asked me this time yesterday, do I think Muscat is in contention? I'd have said I'm not sure. I don't have that information as of yet. However, I do believe his name is in the frame now. There's a lot of complications with that, Blair, because he is in the final stretches of a league campaign in China. He remains under contract in China as well. Could Rangers make that happen? Danny Röhl is not under contract anywhere, and he could start work right away just now. So a lot to get into, but I think Muscat is an interesting name because he was very, very close to it a couple of years ago, and he's been linked with the job heavily, really ever since, and before that as well. And there's arguably some circumstances that would make this a better fit for him now. But again, have to stress that the timing of where he is in that league campaign in China has been put to me as a difficulty because I think Rangers have, if you look at when the Chinese league finishes, Rangers have 7 games or 8 games between then. Now, would he come early? Is he going to do that? I'm not entirely sure. It'd be a quick turnaround for the weekend if you could get that in place. So a lot of moving pieces, and because fundamentally, Blair, Rangers they did not think they would be in this position, sacking Russell Martin after 123 days, and there's not really been a stable footing all season, and they've had to react towards that in this international break.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make there. There's been a lot of talk over the last sort of week about how Rangers aren't perhaps moving with the kind of efficiency and looking for a new manager that a lot of the fans would have wanted. But like you said, this was a completely unexpected situation for this board. They in no way were preparing to have to look for a new manager in October. This was never really on the table. I think they really backed themselves that Russell Martin would work out, but obviously what's came to pass and now the situation that they find themselves in. It's interesting for the fans. I think that you see Kevin Muscat is a name that we can now start to maybe take a little bit more seriously, because
Mm.
up until this point, it looked as though Danny Roll was the only name that was given any sort of credence through all of the discussions. A lot of names come in and ruled out straight away, but Kevin Muscat seems to have picked up a little bit more strength in terms of a contender. But as you said, that is the difficulty being is that the Chinese season is still ongoing and he still has a job to finish there. So, of course, we have that dilemma of would he come to Rangers early if he was interested in making the move? Would he want to stay and see out that season? And perhaps, as I raised on the show with Derek, is it the end of the world to have a caretaker team in until they get the man they really want?
Yeah, well, to your point of would they have expected to make this decision in October? I guess the devil's advocate would be if you make a bad decision, then it puts more pressure on your next decision. And Russell Martin was a really bad decision because he was sacked inside 123 days. And listen, we won't get into it because we've absolutely done it to death. The Muscat has really wanted this job in the past, right? And he's got an impressive record in that he's won leagues in a variety of different countries. Now, people will suggest, but look at the relative strength of those leagues. Chris was saying to me just yesterday, Clement had won league titles before he came to Rangers, and that much is true. Muscat is perhaps got more experience of winning, and to what extent you put emphasis on that, I believe there's an ongoing debate about that at the moment within Rangers because they have this head coach model that Chris and I Chris and I wrote about yesterday. And thinking about it, Blair, a lot of clubs around the world, Inter Milan appointed Christian Chivu, he'd worked in the youth academy at various levels, but he'd only had about 3 months at Parma. Xavi Alonso going to Bayer Leverkusen and then Real Madrid, Mikel Arteta, Enzo Maresca, like more and more and more, the way I would describe it, and we spoke about this in summer, is clubs are building up the structure around the head coach and entrusting them to deal with what's on the pitch. The difference is, I would say, England's a little bit more at the cutting edge of football, right, with the Premier League, and in right across Europe, sporting directors speak. They speak in mix zones. They speak about transfers. So you see that at Bayern Munich, where there's almost like a press conference every day, but also they will have different board members who will speak after games. So there's figureheads. That's not the case here. So that would be my reticent with someone like Danny Rowe, and led to believe that if Danny Rowe were to get the job, he would look to bring in a former Rangers player, someone with a connection to the club on his staff, and he had similarities at that with how he worked at Sheffield Wednesday. So I don't think he'd come in ignorant to the situation whatsoever, and he's worked at huge clubs in the past. But the point is, I think Blair, interested to know what people in the comments think and what you think. The head coach of Rangers will still be a figurehead. They will still kind of have to fill that void. And it's just such a big role with so many demands that if you were to, let's say hypothetically, Danny Rowe were to come in and he were to lose one game at Ibrox, because of the situation, because of the context, the pressure would be on right away. And he managed in very difficult circumstances at Sheffield Wednesday. And that's important to say. That's not a club the size of Rangers, but it's not a small club. It's not an inconsequential club by any means. The argument might be, does Muscat have more of an understanding of, maybe not even so the club, because he's been here, because Russell Martin had that argument too, although different times and again, different contexts. But does his track record of winning league titles, of understanding, having experience of that, is that a small intangible alongside the fact he's maybe a more experienced figurehead that should push him to the front of the race? And as you say, there's other names that Rangers have spoken to. There will be names that we do not know of at certain stages as well. But that's what we wrote yesterday is one of the key decisions for me here. Like it or not, if you have this head coach model, the Rangers head coach is going to be a figurehead. They are going to have to deal with basically everything if you don't have a hugely public-facing CEO or sporting director and you have a chairman who's largely based in the United States. And that really needs to be taken into consideration, because after what happened in the summer, as I say, there's so much more pressure on this decision because the wrong decision was made. So you have to back it up with the right one.
Yeah, I take your point there about even if Rangers are going to go down this route of this new model, which I think we're now pretty much inclined that that's what they're going to do. They're going to go down this model of sporting director, a lot of senior management positions above the manager, so that the manager isn't the be all and end all. Really, I think that from all we're hearing, that seems to be the way that Kavanagh wants to go down. However,
Yeah,
I
and
think that when you
sorry.
carry on.
No. Sorry, you continue. My point's not that important.
I think that when you come to a club like Rangers, there is, and I even compare this to clubs down south. I think that it's such a unique situation that the scrutiny is such that you have to be able, like you said, you have to be that public facing figure, and you have to be able to be answerable all of the time. Now, as you said, if you're going to have this kind of structure and you just want a coach to coach, and that is the main thing, then you need a more public-facing CEO. You need a more public-facing director of football. We need to be hearing from Kevin Thelwell on the regular. We have to be hearing from these guys and coming out and developing this sort of relationship with fans, so that there is somebody that the fans can point to, can ask questions to, and there's more of a connect between the supporters and the club than just the manager. Because if the manager is left to deal with all of that, and then he's also been in charge of the coaching role, you can see how it can swallow managers up. We've seen it with a 4 or 5 the last few managers, that it's all encompassing, and it's almost too much to try and deal with all of that. Now, this, I would say, I point to Xabi Alonso, for example. He's maybe having a tougher time at Real Madrid than, and maybe not results wise, but in terms of just dealing with the culture of being Real Madrid manager. He didn't have the same level of scrutiny at Bayer Leverkusen. He wasn't expected to win at Bayer Leverkusen. He went into Bayer Leverkusen and done an incredible job. But if he hadn't won the league, there wouldn't have been people calling for his head. He would have had that
Yeah.
grace period, and he would have had the time to bed himself in. He goes to Real Madrid, and all of a sudden, if you draw one game, that is absolute chaos, and you've got all the Spanish newspapers on your back. So I think it's a similar, obviously vastly different scales. Don't quote me saying that Rangers and Real Madrid are operating at the same level, but you look at that pressure, and you look at the reaction to not winning games, and it's very much the same. Now, Kevin Muscat for me has always been my first choice. I said that last week when Russell Martin was relieved of his duties. I said the one man for me that I'd be looking at before anybody else is Kevin Muscat. I wanted Kevin Muscat before Steven Gerrard, mostly because I think he ticks a lot of boxes, some tangible, some intangible. He has success as a manager. We can see that on paper. He's won leagues, okay. The quality of those leagues you can maybe question, but is the Scottish Premiership really full of quality? I know it has its own intricacies and its own unique foibles, but the Scottish Premiership is not this world-beating league of fantastic football. So he has on paper a record of winning titles. He also has that. He's played at Rangers. He has an understanding of what it's like, not just to play at Rangers, but to win at Rangers, to be in a team that's won trophies, and to bring that in. And then also he has this aura around him, and he would come into this job, and I think he would command this respect that we talk about earlier on in the week. I think he's the type of man who, if you bring him in, the fans are suddenly on board. A Gerrard-esque, okay, we are now behind this man, and we can back him to do something.
Yeah, again, interested to see what people think, because for me, the Gerrard would have been a true unifying figure for not for everyone, but for most. Muscat, I think, in my opinion, wouldn't quite have the unification to that degree, but there'd be a bit of anticipation. And I think listen, if he comes in and wins games, that will convince anyone, but there would be more suspicion about who is this guy, a bit of an unknown at the start. We're agreed that Rangers need a figurehead at this moment in time, right? and Gerrard would have given that because we often, and Rangers is often regarded to as an institution. And there is that kind of political element. We spoke about it tons with Russell Martin, where it felt like instead of taking the small political wins, the whole summer was spent disregarding that until it was too late, until the noise catches up with you and the fans are outside the stadium, home or away, and creating an atmosphere that you cannot ignore. And again, I think I made this point yesterday, so apologies for repetition, but when we were speaking to Kemar Roofe last week, and this is someone who's worked under 4 managers at Rangers in 4 years, he said, as players, you see it, it is the pressure that gets to managers. It is the size of it. It is the scale of it. Now, Rangers are in a different position compared to when Philippe Clement basically had like no chairman and no CEO and was the footballing figurehead. However, you're still the head coach or the manager. You are still going to be the lightning rod for better or for worse, because that is just how the model is at the moment. And Muscat put a piece on the website today from a couple of years ago, actually, when he was close to the job, Blair, with his assistant in Japan and China, Ross Asioli, I think his name is, who, if I remember correctly, a couple of years ago was very generous with his time. And he gave some fascinating insight into Muscat because he worked with him so closely. He was his assistant manager at in Japan and also followed him to Shanghai port in China for the last year and a half or so. And I just wanted to read one bit out about his style of play and maybe how that fits into where Rangers are at the moment. And Alosi said, this is him speaking in 2023, he's playing a bit differently now because we pressed high last season. A lot of clubs started to do the same. Kevin will adapt to the players he has. He knows what the opposition is doing and is tactically very, very intelligent. He adapts to what he's got, and he's always successful. Everywhere he's been successful, which for me is phenomenal. What I mean by adaptation is that he'll adapt to players to fit his style. So if he's got certain players, he'll play the same brand of football, but in a different way. For example, if he doesn't have an out-and-out striker, he might play someone higher, not as an out-and-out striker, but between the lines, and then you'll get forward runs from that individual. So the point he's making there is a lot of comparisons have been made to him with Postecoglou, who Muscat, worked with and clearly has taken a lot from. But the point that his assistant was making to me there was he's not someone who he wants to play in a certain way, but there is, again, maybe a bit of flexibility within that. So he's not just utilised the 4-3-3, he's played a 4-2-3-1. And maybe then he doesn't have to use inverted fullbacks. He can use a double pivot. All these little specifications that I don't think this helped him a couple of years ago when he was close to the job, Blair, because Rangers had built a squad with high and wide fullbacks and lots of number 10s, which was kind of the flip of the Christmas tree if you're looking at the squad makeup that someone like Muscat would require. So he's flexible, probably within a framework. His football, I think, would be more. Martin's football came down to control. I think Muscat's football would come more down to attack and being offensive and aggressive first and foremost. But again, you have all these complications because hypothetically, if he were to get the job and he were to take it in a month, what state would the season be in? Could you get him in for this weekend if talks were to develop? Is it the right time? Is it the right situation now? Especially when Danny Role is there and ready to take the job at this moment in time, being without a club.
Yeah, that's a really interesting situation. I mean, you look at Danny Role as what you might say the easy option just because of the timing of it, but we've already discussed ad nauseum the amount of complications that might come with Danny Role's appointment. Not all of them down to Danny Role, by the way. A lot of them just because Danny Role hasn't quite had the same level of career as a lot of other these guys, and they haven't got that Rangers connection. Just going back to a much earlier point you said, it's interesting that you had word that Role, if he was to come in, would bring a Rangers man in with him, which I think would be a really, really smart move. I think that's where one of the reasons why Russell Martin fell down a little bit, not having that connection, not having that person on the backroom staff that you could maybe look to and the fans could connect to. I've said it before, just having someone there that's played in the heat of these games and can maybe just offer a little word of advice to a few of the new guys, I think is invaluable. So it'd be interesting to see who he would get in as part of that coaching staff, if he was to bring someone in that regard. As far as Muscat's style of play goes, I think the adaptability really seems to be the key word here, because where Russell Martin failed, and especially at the beginning, he was so set in his ways that he had missed that grace period where he could then change his mind and he could then start to adapt. We've seen it near the end of his tenure where he did start to change things, and it started kind of. You've seen at half time in games where he would throw the tactics out the window and just try something completely different because he's then going for broke because it's not working. So I think that if Muscat has that level of adaptability and he shows it quickly to get results on the board quickly, then I think that is exactly what's needed. Because you look at, and Martin mentioned this himself, the variation in games in Scotland is so drastically different that I think it's a challenge for a lot of coaches to come up with. One day you could be playing away at the Falkirk Stadium, then you could be playing Roma at home, then you could be playing at Hampden in a cup semi-final. These are all very different games that are all very unique tactically, and you need to be astute enough to be able to set up for these games. You can't just pick one system, put them out there and let them play. It doesn't work like that anymore. You have to be able to adapt to what's in front of you, and as you say, more importantly, utilize the players you've got, because I think that there's a lot of these Rangers players that aren't being utilised properly yet, and I think that if they are, then they could be onto a winner.
I have a niche Rangers reference for you, right? Do you remember? It's about 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. Rangers beat Motherwell 1-0. It was one of Michael Beale's final games in charge, and they scored via a deflected Cyril Dessers strike, and it was an absolutely terrible game, right? But I'm going to
possibly the
test
worst 90 minutes I've watched in a long time. Yes.
Yes, apart from the other 25 over the past year or so.
Yeah.
A question for you: do you remember? I think it was Rabbi Matondo was injured early on. Do you remember who came on in his place?
Oh, now you're asking. At risk of alienating the viewers,
Let us know in the comments. Let us know in the comments if who came on and what I'll give you a clue. What tactical switch Rangers made, and there is a point to this. I promise. I'm not just.
I wasn't expecting a quiz this early in the morning, but I'm going to say, was it a defender? Did they go for a defender?
It was a defender. It was, I think, unless someone in the comments is going to embarrass me, it was John Suter, right? I'm pretty sure Rangers went to a back three, right? The reason I'm raising that is it was a terrible game. They created very little. They were defending in like a 5-4-1 against Motherwell in the final 10 minutes. And Ibrox was not happy, right? Because Beale had spoken a lot about this is what the football's going to look like. And they'd lost against PSV, they'd lost against Kilmarnock, lost against Celtic. But what he understood, I think, after that Celtic game was you've just got to win, right? You've just got to it doesn't matter if it's pretty. And ultimately that would be his undoing, I think, because of how he'd spoken up the football over summer. Although that 72% win rate he leaves with doesn't look bad in the context of Rangers in 2025. Absolutely. But the point I'm making, Blair, is I think Martin almost did it backwards in that against Sturm Graz and against Livingston, you saw him throw absolutely everything, effectively abandon any sort of kind of tactical structure. Mikey Moore at left back, two strikers up top. And that's got his place, right? If he'd stuck with his initial template and not chased games, we'd have been criticising him at the time for not throwing the kitchen sink at it. However, I think this whole summer has been an episode of Rangers doing it backwards, where they get the idea and they think this is what we want it to look like, but they don't understand that to implement it, you need buy-in. And if those performances aren't going to come early on, you need results. So what I mean by that is Motherwell on the opening day of the season, Rangers, it's an end-to-end first half. You see some nice patterns of play, but also they concede quite a lot of opportunities and Motherwell look really good. But in the final minutes, instead of going 5-4-1, just shutting up shop and getting out there with a win and saying, wasn't great, you ended the day with a midfield of Connor Barron, Nadeem Bayrami and Lyle Cameron. You can see the goals, not quite in transition, but there's open spaces. What I think needed to happen at the start was more of a recognition of it is the end of the world if you draw 3 games 1-1 at Rangers to open your league campaign. And that's what Russell Martin got wrong. And there's too much of a too much of an ideal, I guess, and not enough. How are we going to achieve the time to make this work over time? So would Muscat give you something like that? Because let's not forget the context of Martin getting the job was that Rangers have been a team really in an identity crisis since Gerrard left. Blair, they've had so much change, so many different managers, and ultimately the managers have then been able to bring in their idea and their system. And just because it's not worked over summer, it does not mean that you necessarily need to go back to that traditional route of ripping everything up every time a new manager comes in. I still think that Gerrard would have a middle ground needed to be found with him, and Rangers needed to get him because of where they are, and what he would have given them. If that is not happening, they still need an identity. They still need a rough structure they can recruit players to and not change from every single year. But they also need someone to buy the time to embed that style. Now, it would be difficult mid-season if it were to be Muscat. It would also be difficult with Roll. But Roll, I think, would give you a little bit more flexibility because he seemed to do that at Sheffield Wednesday. It's a lot of unknowns, and there will need to be a lot of adaptability because of where they are in the season.
With Roll, though, what you're trading off for that is the fact that the fans will probably, I say probably, I'm assuming the fans won't give him as much time as Muscat. Now, that is just a factor of the environment, because I think, and people can tell me if I'm wrong in the comments, I think that Kevin Muscat gets a bit more of a honeymoon period than Danny Rowe does. I think that Kevin Muscat, just because of what he's done with Rangers in the past, and the fact that he's been a player that has been continually linked, a manager that's been continually linked, and he's been a man that has been a top or in the top three of a lot of people's shortlists. I think he gets a bit more buy-in. Thank you to Scott McDonald, who has become a YouTube member. Yeah, obviously there has been a lot of chat. Danny Rowe and Kevin Muscat are the two names that we're talking about. But as you mentioned earlier, there's probably a lot more names in the frame that we don't know about yet. Rocky says Ole Gunnar Solskjaer would be a great manager, and I think it just kind of sums up where we're at the minute. That X and Facebook and Instagram, they're all alight with comments that you can't go on any hour without seeing another name linked with this job. And as we said, there may well be other names that the board are speaking to that we don't yet know about, and it's the time is ticking on. I think that's what really this comes down to. We've got Dundee United on Saturday afternoon. It's now Tuesday, and we're not really further forward in narrowing it down to a definitive one or two candidates. So, as I said before, I wouldn't be surprised if we're going into that game with an interim coaching staff in charge, just because of the way that it panned out with Gerrard. Because that didn't work, it now seems like, right, we're going to have to take our time and make sure the right guy comes in here.
Yeah, I think people can read between the lines and discern for themselves whether Gerrard was the plan or not. Different people you speak to will say different things, but I don't think he was flying in to just be a contender, put it that way, Blair. And again, I've spoke to people in the last 24 hours who've said they do think it's down to between Muscat and Danny Roll. Others, as you say, suggesting there could still be a bit of a red herring, someone who comes out of the blue. And then there's the question of, well, there's quite a few football games to play in the next fortnight or so. You need to give players clarity. You need to give staff clarity about who they're going to be working under. And there's not been a formal interim structure announced. Stevie Smith continues to take training, but he was also taking the under-19s at the weekend. Now, if it was the plan for him to be managing 3 Rangers games, let's say hypothetically, within a fortnight, I don't think he's taken that under-19 game. I think he's been given adequate time to plan and prepare. The first team squad and squad members who were not away on international duty were off this weekend, so that's a factor too. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting few days. We'll keep people up to speed. We've not even got into international duties. We'll maybe do that tomorrow. But Nico Raskin, I gather, I've not watched the game, but I gather he was very good again for Belgium. And Rangers will have a number of players like Raskin and Tello Asgard and others, who Nadeem Barami, who don't even come back until the end of that week for that game against Dundee United. You have 2 home games at Ibrox. against Dundee United and Kilmarnock, sandwiched between that triple win in the Europa League. But one more defeat in either of those competitions puts your campaigns in a very difficult spot. So time is of the essence. Let's see how they go over the next couple of days.
Absolutely. Thank you to Ricky Hampton, who also became a YouTube member. Just one little piece of housekeeping, just because I spotted it on the comments here, Josh, before we go. Blair and Josh, can you give us an update on Sterling, please? Josh, I know this is a player who you've been following his road to recovery pretty closely. Anything you can tell the viewers on when we expect to see him back in a Rangers jersey?
Yeah, but he's been, and I hate this saying, this is a football cliche saying, but here we go. He has been back
You
on
only
the
say he's
grass.
on the grass. Oh, I knew it
Back
was
on the
coming. I
grass.
knew it was coming.
He's been back on the grass for a little while. I'm told that he's recovered a little bit ahead of schedule, and is hoping to be. I think there's a belief and a hope that he could be back on the pitch sometime between early and mid-November. He'll give you strength and depth at the back. I tend to think he might be used at centre back. Again, depends on the manager, but we saw him play there before his injury, so. Yeah, we'll need to also wait and perhaps have an official timeline confirmed by whoever comes in to replace Russell Martin soon, but a little bit ahead of schedule, which is a positive. And if there's always an if with Sterling, because he has had these difficult injury situations. I've said before, I tend to think that he was probably overutilized under Clement, and that didn't help him. Instead of being built up and probably his fitness being maintained over a period of time. Will he play at centre back, right back? He can also cover at left back, where Rangers have been slightly short. I do think Derek Cornelius has looked pretty good in a pretty badly underperforming team so far, but I don't think his best position is at left back. So there's a bit of a shortage there too. And Sterling's definitely someone who can give you a bit of cover right across the board.
Brilliant. Well, Josh, thanks very much for joining me this morning to discuss all things Rangers. We will, of course, be the first to keep you updated with any other movements as Rangers search for a head coach. So keep it locked to the Rangers Review YouTube channel on, of course, X and Facebook, where we'll be posting all the news first. Josh, thanks very much for joining me today, and thanks very much to everyone out there for listening, and thanks very much for watching.